So I'll try to give thank you for inviting me, and thank you for attending. This is a great opportunity for me to present our work, this book, and so yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to present today, and if there's any questions about concepts or language during the presentation, please, I'd appreciate if you just raise your hand and say précision, because otherwise, you know, the narrative could get lost if you don't understand important things that are coming along. Okay. So this book is a reflection of a collective effort with Justus Altemark, and so we wrote this book largely because of the fact that we were working at the University of Amsterdam, and we were both interested in cities, politics, and social movements, and we'd both done extensive research on immigration politics. Him in Amsterdam primarily. Me in the United States and a little bit in France, and we thought it would be interesting to see to have a discussion and to write a book. And that was the basis of this book. It was a series of long discussions which resulted in this piece. And we were looking at a particular empirical puzzle when we're starting our work. We were noticing sort of a weird phenomenon in many different cases. So we were noticing that in the case of Amsterdam, we saw that the nation state was getting increasingly restrictive. So it was tightening its borders. It was passing laws to restrict migration and to legalize people through refugee laws. And it was also engaging in deportation. So it was going and finding people in the streets and trying to deport them for papers. So we're noticing that at the national level, the nation state was increasing restrictions on immigration, but that the implementation of this was happening in concrete spaces, especially places with lots of immigrants. So we noticed that there was a restrictive nation state, that these types of bordering practices, the practice of identifying people and then and deporting them or ripping them out of the city was happening locally, was happening in localities. And then oftentimes this process resulted in an initial resistance, moral shock. People were outraged. Like, how are you detaining so-and-so? How are you detaining our neighbor? It's morally wrong. So what we're seeing is that there was the nation state was getting increasingly restrictive, that these laws were being enacted locally. They're detaining people. People in localities and neighborhoods were pushing back. They started to resist. And many of these resistances were connecting to organizations located in cities like Amsterdam, so human rights organizations in particular, lawyers. So you have these resistances that started spouting up. Organizations started coming in and providing these resistances support, and this would grow. They would grow into mobilization. So something like the sans-papiers movement is very sort of typical of this. So you would have growing mobilizations of refugees here, and sometimes these would scale out, meaning that they would get bigger and bigger and start mobilizing and asking the national government for certain types of reforms or policies. So we noticed we noticed this was happening in the Netherlands. This was one case, the Wij zijn hier movement, mobilization in Amsterdam. Again, this sort of a basic process. The nation state comes in, people are being kicked out of the country, locals start to get angry, they start to say, no, you can't do that. Bigger organizations come in, provide support, political parties, personalities, media, it grows, and it's able to put some pressure on the government. A similar thing through mobilization in France, Réseau Éducation Sans Frontières, RESF, very sort of similar thing. Restrictive nation state, these things happening locally, people being kicked out of schools, police coming and getting kicked out of schools, the immigrants themselves being morally outraged along with parents in the particular site. This very small mobilization gaining support from large organizations, unions, etc., and these things growing into sort of potentially politically important struggles. Most recently in Los Angeles, we saw a similar thing. This guy right here, Romulo Avelica. We see this guy, my president. He initiated a series of increasingly restrictive national policies about immigration, and particularly a very aggressive, deportation policy, giving more money to national federal law enforcement agencies to deport people. And again, this happened enacted locally. So on February 27th, 2017, a couple weeks after the president was inaugurated, the police start to identify undocumented migrants, the sans-papiers. And this guy, Romulo, was arrested in front of his school. And his daughter is here, and she was filming this. So she was arrested and then put through deportation proceedings in front of the school. And this resulted in a resistance, moral shock, and a spark of local resistance from the family and the school. People at the school were started to mobilize, like a very similar situation to Echo SF. And this guy right here, he was friends. He's the director of the school. He was friends with this woman right here, who works for an association, an immigrant rights association. So you see a network being connected. And she's also a lawyer, and that she was able to connect to labor organizations, to lawyers all throughout the city, and they were able to mobilize the resources of the city in order to increase the visibility of this campaign. And this turned into a very, very large campaign using this particular act of deportation as a way to denounce the sort of the Trump administration's deportation policies, bringing in priests, politicians, this guy right here, and neighborhood associations. So it became a very large coalition. It grew bigger and bigger. It became sort of the mayor of Los Angeles got involved. Romulo was freed. And he became the poster, sort of the leading face of a law that was passed in California that was called the Sanctuary State Law. So it was a law that said that local police cannot participate with the federal government in deporting people. So Romulo became hooked up into this larger campaign to stop any kind of participation between the federal government and local police force on immigration matters. So they created this law called SB 54, and this was Romulo with the important politicians that were behind this law. So again, and then this resulted in fights with the federal government. So these are the federal government coming in and saying, this is illegal to have a sanctuary state law, etc. So these are sort of vignettes to sort of give you an idea of what we're sort of interested. We're interested in sort of cities. How is it in these different cases that the city became a terrain, an environment for supporting, nurturing immigrant rights movements, or any kind of movement, in fact. So we're interested in what is it about the city that facilitates and helps to grow and transforms small resistances of, say, 4 or 5 people, one family, into large-scale mobilization. So we're interested in how the state comes down, creates sort of repression, enacts repressive regimes, how those regimes spark small resistances, very small resistances, and how the city functions as a space that can transform these small resistances and grow these resistances into powerful mobilizations that can change national state policy, as was the case with this and these other cases that we've talked before. So I'm going to walk really quickly through 4 theoretical propositions because I don't want to speak for 45 minutes on theoretical propositions. That's bad. So theoretical proposition 1 is, in this book, guiding this book, was restrictive national borders are enacted locally. So when the nation state, it's a very sort of simple idea, when the nation state is closing down its borders and tightening immigration, that happens locally. That it doesn't necessarily happen at the frontiers, that happens in neighborhoods, particularly where immigrants are. So the closing of borders results in diffusing border restrictions into everyday life. Many people become a part of the bordering machine. The second idea that we put together is that cities are places for politicizing marginalized groups and sparking resistance. So this is an idea that Sébastien Chauvin, a French sociologist now located in Switzerland, argues. He argues that when immigrants are settled into places for long periods of time, they become incorporated. If you're undocumented, you become incorporated within a locality, and you have what he called de facto citizenship. People sort of think of you as a normal resident, and you develop what he would call de facto citizenship with normative rights. You don't necessarily have de jure rights, but you have de facto rights. At least a sense of those rights. And when state restrictions disrupt lives, this creates what James Jasper, sociologist called James Jasper, calls a moral shock. So we can sort of see this idea of the nation state enacting restrictions. These restrictions are enacted in localities against people who think they have a right to stay. And with neighbors who are imbricated in relationships with other people in localities and networks who also think they have a right to stay. Okay, they have legitimacy. And this becomes the basis of moral shock. So normative rights plus state repression, we would argue, sparks resistance. Okay? However, resistance can happen anywhere, but we argue that cities provide a specific environment that helps to transform that resistance, this very small resistance, into a large mobilization. So cities help fan sparks of resistance by connecting resistant actors to diverse supporters. And this is a very basic idea. Cities are important, we would argue, because they contain, there's organizational density, meaning that there's a lot of organizations located in cities and a lot of different organizations. So you have unions, you have lawyers, you have associations, you have media. These are different organizational actors with different types of resources, and these resources could be important. The second important factor we argue is important of cities is that there's many opportunities for creating new connections. So cities are places with a lot of opportunities to meet other actors because there are connecting points, like cafes, events, universities, workshops, protests. So there's many opportunities for people to connect to one another in one way or another. And there's also many brokers. Many people know each other in cities. So not only are there lots of organizations, but there's many different ways, many opportunities, what we call relational opportunities, many opportunities for people to get to know each other in cities, to connect that original point of resistance to these organizations. It doesn't require too many brokers. It's not too distant. It increases the probability of resources, of connections being established, and resources being funneled in and channeled into these resistances. So again, an example of this is the support from immigrant rights, legal advocates, neighborhood association for Romulo Avelica's case. That there weren't only organizations, lots of organizations in the city, but there was also the director of the school that was able to broker a relationship to the immigrant rights organization. Okay? So our last argument, and this is something that we've developed a little bit more recently, is that these types of relationships, there's always resistance in cities, small resistances going on in cities, there's lots of organizations going on in cities, but not all cities develop the same mobilization capacity. Some cities do, some cities don't. So how do we explain for that? And we have a two-point argument for this. We argue that states co-opt. States co-opt, and they bring organizations in, They can exert control over the organizations, and they encourage organizations not to get involved with other contentious actors. But in addition to this, there's also what we would call sort of relational dynamics between organizations. Competition between organizations for resources reduces network cohesion. So if you have a lot of organizations in a neighborhood, a lot of organizations, and organizations compete for the same money, for the same type of legitimacy, this reduces their willingness to cooperate with one another. Competition for resources reduces cohesion between organizations. So when there's lots of resource overlap, how do you say overlap from? So yeah, okay. So when there's resource overlap, when the organizations are competing for the same money, there's less likelihood that there's going to be cooperation. So we would argue, combining these two important sort of theoretical ideas, that when states co-opt a lot, and there's lots of organizational competition, then that there's an increased likelihood of network fragmentation. By contrast, when there's low co-optation by the state and low organizational competition, there's increased likelihood for network cohesion. So we would argue that when restrictive national borders are enacted locally, they disrupt the lives of they're enacted in the everyday lives of people. Cities, these places, the points in which repression is enacted sparks resistance all the time. A lot of times these resistances can gain support from the organizations operating in the city. But an intervening factor is whether these organizations cohere into a stable network or fragmented network. Depends on organizational competition for resources and the co-optation capacities of the state. When the state is co-opting organizations, it could intensify conflict between organizations, and this will make it less likely for organizations in cities to cohere into a cohesive mobilization. So I'm going to talk about today, so those are sort of the things in the back of our head. So I'm going to talk today about the cases of Los Angeles and Paris. I left out Amsterdam because it's Amsterdam. No, because there's not enough time. So we're looking at the way the book is structured is that we look at these cases and we start off with the idea. I'll just present a sort of an outline of the book. We start off with the 1970s, and we look at both cases, and we say that there is high levels of mobilizations. There's high levels of state repression in the 1970s, or at least the initiation of state repression on immigration in the 1970s. But we also see high levels of mobilization. So we see in Paris and Los Angeles mobilization, state repression, and mobilization. So both cities, Los Angeles and Paris, are becoming important hubs of immigrant rights activism, among other cities, but these become really sort of stand out. However, by the time we get to the 1990s and 2000s, we see something very different. They move into different directions. Los Angeles becomes a central hub of a national social movement with national reach, while Paris is more fractured. It's a fragmented, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of people struggling, but the network is super fractured. People don't get along with one another. People will come out to a protest, but that's it. So our question is, how did this happen? And our argument is that these two factors, again, state co-optation capacity and organizational dynamics, degree of competition between an organization, helps us to explain why Los Angeles went this way and Paris went this way. So Los Angeles. So again, 1970s, the state starts to enact a variety of different laws to deport people. And this results in mobilization. So this is the beginning of the immigrant rights movement in Los Angeles. And it becomes pretty coherent, and it becomes very connected to what was called back then the Chicano movement. So the Chicano movement provided an important role in sustaining the first immigrant rights activists in the United States. So I want to focus on the 1980s because this is where the puzzle happens. So in Los Angeles in the 1980s, we have the introduction of a few new organizations, sort of new immigrant rights organizations that are pretty radical, coming from El Salvador, coming from the Civil War in El Salvador, Korean sort of hardcore left revolutionary politics, Mexico, and the Philippines. So there's an influx of radical organizers into Los Angeles that are organizing around class and organizing around empowering workers to be, immigrant workers to be revolutionaries. And they're organizing like crazy. And they're organizing in the central part of the city. So this is like the sort of the immigrant neighborhoods become intense neighborhoods filled with fairly radical activities, filled with these people who consider themselves comrades. At the same time, there is also a new effort within unions, certain radical union activists who were trying to organize immigrants as well, and they were arguing, especially in the service sector and cleaners, hotels, and things like that. And they were arguing that this is the most important part of the labor force in Los Angeles, and it's completely ignored. And they were starting to invest a lot of money in organizing immigrants, as well as innovative intellectuals over at the University of California, Los Angeles, and University of Southern California, who started to invest resources, who started to invest a lot of money into providing support for, especially for these guys and these guys. So the university, these people working for the university, argued that we have to turn the resources out from the university and provide direct support, intellectual support for the new immigrant rights organizing and the innovative unions. And there were also important interdependencies. These organizations had the same ideological goals. They wanted, and they had this sort of same ideology, similar ideology, strongly influenced by Marxism. And they also had a similar goal, which is the political empowerment of immigrant workers. So they had this, and they're pretty ambitious as well. They also had little resource overlap. They weren't competing for the same resources. They had different members, different financial supporters, different sources of legitimacy. Okay, so there was no resource overlap or very little resource overlap. So that this similar goals, little resource overlap. And what's also important is that in order to achieve their ambitious goals, they had to work together. So they were pretty poor. And so in this particular instance, cooperation between these organizations made sense. So conditions encourage cooperation and growing interdependency. So in this particular situation, we see organizations talking to one another, hanging out with one another, and being drawn to one another through their resource interdependencies. At the same time, there was weak co-optation capacity. The power of the state to co-opt organizations was weakened because of the fact that the government there were cuts to the government. So the money that would have been given to provide subsidies to organizations that were coming up disappeared. So the ability for the state, the local state, to entrap organizations into subsidies was severely cut. So community block grants, this is the money for these types of subsidies, was cut by 36%. But the federal government's money to cities was cut fairly dramatically, and this is a period of pretty intense recession. So the state didn't have the capacity, the fiscal capacity to initiate, to actually co-opt. And then in the 1990s, so we have organizational conditions that favor cooperation, and we have weak co-optation capacities for the state. Okay, so the political conditions and the organizational conditions favor cooperation. And then in the 1990s, there were a series of events which accelerated cooperation. So first, there were riots in 1992, 1993, sort of $1 billion riots that tore through the city. And there was anti-immigrant politics that started to unfold at this time. So these were what we call catalyzing events. These were events that spurred cooperation, that spurred organizations that had overlapping interests to cooperate with one another, and there was a weak capacity of the state to co-opt these organizations. And these organizations, once they started cooperating with one another, worked with one another over an extended period of time on a series of many different campaigns. In each of these efforts to work with one another, from organizing janitors to living wage for a minimum wage campaign to immigration reform, each of these campaigns helped to solidify and tighten the network structure between these organizations. And this created enormous amounts of power, what we would call sort of insurgent power, which resulted in extremely high mobilization capacity. So this was sort of the high point. 2006, it's after all these types of networks are being developed over the 10 previous years. The most important immigrant rights protest, the largest protest in the history of the city, was 500,000 people, and it was an immigrant rights demonstration. So that's sort of an indicator of mobilization capacity. When you can mobilize 500,000 people, that's pretty good mobilization capacity. So Paris. So similar, 1970s, we have a series of laws that are increasingly repressive, and we also have resistances started to spark up all throughout the country and in Paris as well. So here we have a different configuration of state. Here, when we go into the 1980s, we argue that the capacity of the state to co-opt organizations became very strong. So the one mechanism for doing this was controlling immigrant organizations through FAS. These were sort of immigrant organizations rather than the human rights organizations, we argue. So there is control over immigrant organizations through FAS, Fonds d'Action Sociale. So these were various comments that the people that we interviewed mentioned, just that the capacity of the state, that when you would if you protested, that this would call into question your ability to continue subsidies. So also co-opting immigrant youth movement through SOS Racism, co-opting grassroots associations through the Politique de la Ville, and stigmatizing disruptive organizations by calling them Islamists. So we have a full force, we argue in this book, a full force rollout of different techniques to co-opt independent immigrant civil society in France during the 1980s. With the state introducing FAS, or just reconfiguring FAS in order to incorporate the new immigrant organizations that were first recognized in 1981, co-opting youth movements through SOS Racism, co-opting the grassroots through Politique de la Ville, and stigmatizing disruptive organizations. So in Weberian terms, this is a massive cage that's being rolled out into civil society in order to really sort of fracture it. So the independent civil society was being sort of dismantled, or at least controlled, caged, to use Weber's term. And again, what we argue is that there was uneven state co-optation. So while the state was co-opting immigrant civil society, other groups, especially, were being permitted to a certain extent. So the human rights associations like LDH, MRAP, FASTI, and GC were facing fewer controls. So the director of MRAP said to me that there was no problem. When I interviewed the folks over at the immigrant organizations, they said yes, we're constantly facing controls and surveillance by our funders. Whereas the folks over at Immigrant and FASTI said it's never a problem. So what we start to see is an uneven cooptation capacity of the state. And then there were the collectifs de sans-papiers that basically escaped the state, the instruments created by the state in order to co-opt them, especially when they first came up. They were eventually co-opted, but when they first came up, there was no mechanism that the state had in place to absorb them and place them in a cage. So what we see is caging traditional immigrant civil society, but permitting others. So we have the collectifs and the human rights organizations coming into the 1990s become the propulsive force of immigrant rights movements. They're the leaders of this movement. And then the case of Saint Bernard became a point in which sort of accelerated interdependencies between these organizations. So Pasqua laws were passed in 1993, if I remember correctly, with restrictions on legalizing immigration status. The undocumented immigrants occupy Saint-Ambroise and Saint Bernard. And initially, the human rights and the collectifs connected through a broker. So this guy named Jean-Paul Amarin, some of you might know him, who ran an association, a squatter organization that worked with a lot of immigrants called Droit Devant. And so this Jean Amarin, he served in our argument as a broker. He worked already with the collectifs, but he also worked with the association, the human rights associations, like LDH. And according to the minutes, he played an important role in connecting them, in connecting these two different worlds together. So this is actually through the archives, archival information of FASTI. There were minutes about this relationship. So FASTI says, well, that Amara has come to call on the FASTIs to get the word out and to bring in the other organizations in order to support this emerging resistance. And then they did, and so FASTI played this role. So Amara came, connected to FASTI. FASTI called its own allies in the human rights world. These organizations came out in support. And then Jean-Paul Amarin replies and sends a thank you letter, which is very nice, I think. We are pleased that you have declared yourself in favor of the regularization of the sans-papiers of Saint-Ambroise, etc. So this becomes sort of the point in which these organizations come together and start to mobilize. And they had overlapping goals, which was the regularization of the sans-papiers. Little resource overlap. They weren't competing for resources, but they also had interesting interdependencies. Human rights had expertise and money, political capital and legitimacy, and the collectifs had immigrants, so which the human rights organizations didn't have. So there was resource interdependencies. Each of these organizations had different people, different resources that made this type of cooperation effective. And then once they had this structure, then they were able to attract other people in the Paris milieu: unions, intellectuals, cultural elite, and favorable press coverage. So this is the takeoff. And so the president LDH says that, uses this language of Saint Bernard becoming a giant village where we all converge to provide support for the sans-papiers. Working like this, working under these conditions, help transform the relations between our different groups because we really learn to work together, which is sort of an interesting statement of proximity. The people, they're coming together. They have resource interdependencies, but it's working together on a daily basis in constant struggle that permits these types, that permits the sort of an ability to pool resources effectively and plan effective strategies. However, there is also competition. So in terms of competition between the more power they started to gain, the more there was a hierarchy between the human rights organizations and the collectives. The human rights organizations had cultural capital, legal capital, they had political legitimacy. So all of a sudden they became, even though they were called the supporters, they became leaders. So they organized different leadership groups like the Group of 10 and the Collège des Médiateurs. But these were people who assumed leadership, sort of white intellectuals who were assuming leadership over over this struggle, and that became a competition over legitimacy and leadership. So there is a lot of people who were quite critical of the human rights organizations at this time. So one guy from this one collective told me, well, the supporters, that's the National Human Rights Associations, manipulate the undocumented immigrants, so they're not supporters, or they support the people like a rope supports a hanged person. I always thought that's funny. Pendu. So in addition to this, and it's also, these are sort of notes from the minutes, which are describing, go into extensive detail about describing how the collectives are getting out of control. And how it's important that the national organizations impose some discipline on them. So just to cut to it, so this one in the minutes, this one note said, we believe that the African groups are influenced by the extreme left. The Group of 10, which was the leadership of the human rights organizations, has to reassert its relationships to the collectives because we give these struggles their character. Their struggles alone are not the same as ours. So in addition to that, in addition to this type of competition between the collectives and the human rights organizations, there's also increased organizational competition between the collectives themselves. So in Paris, there's many collectives that are sprouting around this time because they're increasingly seen as vehicles for getting your immigration papers. So if you squat a place and you put enough pressure on the prefect, it became seen as a way of regularizing your status. So all over Paris, you see the proliferation of different collectives, and they start to compete with one another for members and for legitimacy. Okay, so there's more competition between the collectives for membership and legitimacy in the particular city of Paris, and this was a repeated theme in my interviews, saying that in Lille and other small towns where there was only one collective, things were fine, but in the big city, there were 15 different collectives, and they were always competing with one another, and this was destroying the fabric of the social movement network. So in this way, in terms of organizational dynamics, what we start to see is increasing competition between collectives and human rights associations, and increasing competition between collectives. So we see in this way, it's the networks between the networks between these different organizations start to weaken pretty dramatically. And here, the state steps in and to exacerbate the conflicts. It really sort of pounds these conflicts, and it makes the conflicts, these competition, into open conflicts between organizations. So one way of doing this is by sending fear into the associations by subsidy cuts to the human rights associations. So the Minister of Integration ordered that 500,000 francs of subsidies be cut to the FASTI for its political work, stating that public sector will no longer subsidize associations of counter-power. So this was a letter sent to the FASTI, and the idea was to send fear into all the different associations that they were working with, using FASTI as an example, a spectacular example, in order to minimize and spread fear and uncertainty for their political work. But also what's interesting is that in terms of exacerbating conflict and uncertainty is that the government determines, the government started to regularize certain immigrants on the basis of certain things like family ties and time and country. No? So they said, well, we're going to regularize you, but not you. And the organizations, so that the organizations, the human rights associations, were responsible for bringing up the list, for receiving the lists of who would get regularized, and it was the associations that would submit these lists to the state, and the state would say, well, we're going to regularize half, and the other half, no. So this, all of a sudden, that the state, that these organizations start to be given responsibility for making these types of choice between sort of deserving immigrants and undeserving immigrants. So this one person from Collectif 93 told me, all these people, the sans-papiers, accepted to take important risks, but all they were doing was providing support for the strongest applicants, the parents. It is not fair that everybody takes the same risks, but only a few benefits. So this really starts to get into, starts to not only weaken the relationship between the sans-papiers, but it also weakens the relationship between the sans-papiers and the human rights organizations who were seen as being responsible for this, even though that they weren't. They were just sort of in charge of taking the dossiers to the government, but they were seen as, they were being attributed blame. So in this instance, we argue that state magnifies competition, conflict, and distrust between collectifs and human rights associations and between collectifs. So when we get to the 2006, this is where we sort of end off with the Los Angeles case with those big demonstrations of 500,000 people. By the time we get to 2006 in France, we see weaker mobilizations such as Immigration contre l'immigration non jetable or jetable. And we see like very low mobilization capacities, even though it's Sarkozy, a very unpopular president. We see people mobilizing, a few people here and there, but a lot of the people who are mobilizing are the human rights organizations with very little capacity to mobilize that whole other sector of collectifs. So this one director of an organization responded to one of my questions and said, well, what's wrong now? She said, well, for me, the problem with the movement in France, and she was talking in 2007, the problem with me in France is that there were these problems between the collectifs and the support associations, and that resulted in a real schism within the coalition, this new coalition. Among the collectifs, there are strong levels of mistrust towards the support associations, and also the associations have a critical view vis-a-vis the collectifs des sans-papiers, notably because they had these very difficult relations in the past. So to summarize the Paris part, the state capacity to co-opt was high, but also uneven. It was also uneven. It neutralized traditional immigrant activism from the 1970s and early 1980s, really sort of just neutralized that part, but it permitted human rights associations and collectifs. Organizational dynamics, also, there was high cooperation in the early days, but followed by high competition. As there was growing competition between the human rights groups and the collectifs, and between the collectifs themselves. And they were competing over leadership, legitimacy, and members. And lastly, the state exacerbated. It aggravated these conflictual relationships by dividing immigrants into some people who got papers, some people who didn't, and threats of subsidy cuts. So in this particular instance, the way that the state played a role in this last bit of accelerating and accentuating the different types of fractured relationships in this social movement. So if we go back to the Los Angeles, the comparison between Paris and Los Angeles, we do see potent mobilizations. They both start off in the 1970s with high mobilization capacities and sort of these broad and cohesive networks. Then you start to see But they move in very different directions. In Los Angeles, we called it a hub, which means that there's strong interdependent relationships making up the network, made up, also nurtured by consistent face-to-face interactions between people over a long period of time, which we suggest enhances their collective power, creating what we would call sort of an agglomeration effect. In Paris, we see a lot of, it's a container. The Paris serves, there's a lot of people, there are a lot of organizations, there are a lot of angry people, but they're not cohesive. There's a fractured relationships between the people, which results in a mobilization structure in which it's fairly weak mobilization structure. And again, we would answer this by arguing that the state co-optation capacity in Los Angeles was very weak. There was a severe rollback in the amount of money used to subsidize organizations in Los Angeles. So there was simply no money to co-opt at this period of time. And at the same time, there are organizational dynamics between so there was lots of sort of overlapping interests and projects that resulted in this sort of cohesive social movement infrastructure. And as opposed to Paris, in which we see organizational dynamics of conflict and competition, and with the state capacity co-opt really high and working to exacerbate those conflicts. So big picture takeaway, where there are borders, there is resistance. Forces of resistance are concentrated sometimes in cities, not always. Cities become battlefields through which fights for rights and belonging are fought out. And the intensity of a resistance or a mobilization is uneven between cities, largely because of organizational dynamics, whether organizations are cooperating or not, plus state co-optation capacity. The end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.